Act 1, Scene 7, and the final scene of the act, and everything is brought together to this critical turning point for the Macbeths in the play. We see in a bit more detail the relationship between the two and Lady Macbeth's ability to coerce her husband into this. Because after the initial agreeing to the killing of Duncan, Macbeth has changed his mind and knows that it's wrong. And Lady Macbeth kind of chucks everything at him. She's using everything in her power to persuade him to continue with the scheme. We're going to see some of the really critical quotations from the play. If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twould well it were done quickly. This idea of if it would be over, if the killing was the end of it all, then it's better just to get it over and done with. But Macbeth senses that it's not just going to be as simple as killing the king. This is going to have ramifications, it's going to have repercussions, which obviously we do see later on in the play. And we see the reason that he gives for thinking about why he shouldn't do it is he says, I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition which overleaps itself and falls on the other. So he understands that actually there is no reason, it's just him, it's his ambition that is driving him to do this. And we see Lady Macbeth's coercion when she says, when you just do it, then you were a man. So she's kind of picking away at this idea of masculinity here. I'm going to see that in a bit more detail as we move through this act. Getting into the text now, we can see that opening line that I've just talked about. If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly. And this idea of Macbeth knowing the ramifications of what he's about to do and the fact that it's not just going to end with the killing of Duncan. And he goes on, and perhaps this bit that I've highlighted in red for you goes a bit further. He says, in these cases, we still have judgment here. And this is twofold, really. He recognises that judgment here, he has a judgment. He has the ability to make the choice. He still has an option. And it also alludes to the idea of judgment, the final judgment of Judgment Day, when it's decided whether or not you will move on to heaven or whether you'll be damned to hell. So there's a kind of a dual meaning to this line, with Macbeth understanding that he has a choice, but then understanding that that choice will be judged by God and that he will have to come to terms with the decision that he makes. And he continues to say that we but teach bloody instructions, which being taught return to plague the inventor. So he is going into this idea with open eyes. He's looking at this and saying, if I go through with this, I'm going to be haunted by my actions. I'm not going to be able to live the life that I think I'm going to live. So we do see this as the play unfolds. And I think it's really important that we pause and recognize at this point, he understands what it is that he's contemplating doing. He then goes on and tries to convince himself that this is not a good idea. And he thinks about this idea of Duncan being there in double trust. Firstly, because Macbeth is his kinsman, he is his relation. There's evidence that he would perhaps have been a cousin or a distant cousin of King Duncan's, and therefore they are related. And therefore it's not appropriate for him to decide to kill him. And he's also there as his subject. So, this is his king. He is loyal to him. He owes him his fidelity. And he goes further and he says, but, that's not the only reason why I shouldn't do it. Besides this, I'm his host. He's in my house. I should be the person who is protecting him, not the one who, holds the knife myself and does it. I should be shutting the door, shutting out the murderers and keeping him safe whilst he's in my house. So he's already given himself a couple of reasons as to why he shouldn't go through with this. And then he begins to think even more deeply. And he says, well, but besides that, Duncan is an amazing person. His faculties, his character is so meek. He's been such a good king. He's been great in office, that everything about this would be wrong. His virtues, his characters, his goodness would plead like angels that he shouldn't be killed. And so Macbeth has got to the point where he's convinced himself that this is not a good idea. And he recognises that last couple of lines before Lady Macbeth comes in, that it's only his own ambition. It's his vaulting ambition that is pricking his sides, that's acting as the spur, that's making him want to commit this. And so we see Macbeth here really torn. We know that he's ambitious. We know that he really wants that kingship, but he doesn't want to kill the king in order to achieve it. And he's echoing what Lady Macbeth had said earlier in Act 1, Scene 5, where she says, It's not that you're without ambition, it's that you're too full of the milk of human kindness. And this is exactly being brought to life in this first section of the scene 7. Macbeth decides to tell Lady Macbeth that he's changed his mind. He makes the statement, "We will proceed no further in this business." He's made the decision that it is not right for them to kill the king. He says the king has honoured him of late, that he has, given him a new title and that he's respected and that people love him. And so he doesn't see why he should do something to spoil that, to ruin that. He wants to wait and see what will happen. And Lady Macbeth is cross. And she is so cross. And we know that she will turn and start to use all of her charms here because she was expecting this. She said that, she wanted him to come quickly. "Hie thee hither so that I may pour my spirits in thine ear." She has anticipated this moment and been planning what she is going to say. And she calls him so green and pale and sickly. She talks to him about, what is it about you that means that you can't go through with this? Are you so afraid to act in one way, to actually go through it, to be the same in the own act as you are in desire? So she says, "I know you want this. Why are you so frightened to go through with it? Be a man." And he says, "But I dare do all that becomes a man." And he's thinking of himself here as that heroic warrior. He's killed before. He says, "Nobody dares to do more than me. Nobody is more masculine than me." And so Lady Macbeth challenged him again. She says, "Well, what was it then that's made you break your promise to me? When you do it, then you're a man, and you would be so much more the man. You would be the king. You just have to go through with it." And then she goes further, and this to me is the most disturbing image I think I've ever seen in a Shakespeare play. It's really brutal in the way that she then describes breastfeeding a baby, her baby, while it's smiling up at her in a really maternal, natural image. And she talks about plucking this baby away from her nipple while it's in the middle of feeding and dashing its brains out, smashing its head so hard onto the ground that its brains would come out of its skull if she'd promised that she'd do it. I mean, the imagery in itself is barbaric, for anybody to even contemplate this sort of act. But I think it's something that's even more frightening given the fact that she is a woman and she is talking about, killing her own child. And it's really, really disturbing. And I think that people who see her as perhaps more vulnerable or perhaps, the grieving mother, this doesn't sit right. It feels very evil. And potentially we could say this is the spirits that she has called to come and unsex her. Perhaps that is working, it's overtaking her. But certainly the language that she uses here and that juxtaposition between the natural image of the baby smiling in her face and her dashing the brains out creates a very uncomfortable atmosphere at the end of this opening part of this scene. And Macbeth is perhaps more practical here. He says, well, what if we fail? And she says, "We fail." So notice he uses a question mark. He's questioning her. And then she reacts with the exclamatory sentence, "We fail." She can't believe that he's even thinking about this. She's so confident in the plan that she doesn't even contemplate the fact that they could fail at this. And she again goes that imperative. She informs him. She tells him to screw his courage to the sticking place. Okay, so she says, hold your nerve here. We'll not fail if you just do what you've been told. And then she outlines her plan. She talks about the fact that they're going to drug the guards that are there with him, and then they're going to use their daggers to kill the king, and they will get away with it because what could they not get away with if Duncan is left unguarded? And Macbeth is quite taken aback by this, and he says this comment, "Bring forth men children only, for thy undaunted mettle should compose nothing but males." I think my interpretation here is that he's slightly intimidated by her. He's saying, God forbid you have any female children. There's nothing female about you. You should never have women because you would be a brilliant man. And there is this idea of this kind of surprise at this power that Lady Macbeth seems to be having at her disposal and the planning, the Machiavellian scheming that she's been up to. Macbeth is quite taken aback, and I think he sees his wife in a new light at this point. And it certainly has convinced him because he says, "I am settled." So he'd originally said, "We'll proceed no further." Now he's saying, "Oh, okay then, let's do it." And then he says, away and mock the time with fairest show. So, you know, until it's time to do it, let's be jovial, let's be happy, let's pretend nothing's going on, because false face must hide what the false heart doth know. So it's again going back to that idea of to beguile the time, you must look like the time, look like the innocent flower, be the serpent beneath it. He's recognizing that he needs to be duplicitous, he needs to act in a certain way, but his heart's desires are going to come to fruition. And so at this point, we've just finished Act 1, and it's important for you in your own understanding to pause and think about exploring the relationship between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. Think about what we've learned about Lady Macbeth. Think about what we've learned about Macbeth. What do we learn from them when we see them interacting together? And just make sure that you go back and you think about that development over the first act, the exposition of the play, when we're introduced to these characters and their behaviour and their relationships, and think very carefully about what you perceive their relationship to be like, because you're going to need this as a point of comparison for later on when we start to see that relationship breaking down. And in terms of making sure that you have nailed down this scene, because it is crucial in the play, it is the turning point. Thinking about your draw it, create a pictogram featuring Lady Macbeth and Macbeth discussing the murder. Think about making sure you've got that visual representation surrounded by quotes. Imagine it. Think about directing this scene. Think about how you would have Macbeth and Lady Macbeth moving around the stage. Would you have them very still? Would you have them moving around? Which bits would they move together? Where would they move away? How would you have them say their lines? What do you want to portray about their relationship at this point? Really important to help your understanding. If you can think about how you would do it if you were going to direct it, really helps you focus on that motivation of those characters. Perhaps, again, you're more creative if you want to write it. Imagine you, Lady Macbeth, write a monologue from the moment this scene ends, detailing how you managed to manipulate Macbeth. How are you feeling? Do you feel satisfied? Had you anticipated it? Had you already thought about how you were going to convince him? Make sure you've got that real reflective element. It's like a reflective journal at this point, trying to capture the events that have just happened. Or turn that idea that we just looked at on the last slide into a mini essay. You know, how does Shakespeare present Macbeth and Lady Macbeth's relationship in this opening act? Which elements are important? Go back to that Act 1, Scene 5, where she receives the letter and she's thinking about him as a person. Then when we see them for the first time together, and now as we begin to see them discussing their evil and cunning plan.